Audible Inc. presents Feminism, a very short introduction, by Margaret Walters, read by Allison Johnson.
Introduction. I myself have never been able to find out precisely what feminism is, the writer Rebecca West remarked sardonically in 1913. I only know that people call me a feminist whenever I express sentiments that differentiate me from a doormat or a prostitute. The word was a comparatively new one when she wrote. It had only appeared in English from the French in the 1890s. Interestingly, the earliest examples of the word in the Oxford English Dictionary carried negative meanings. In 1895, the Athenaeum sneeringly referred to a piece about a woman whose coquetting with the doctrines of feminism are traced with real humor. In Germany, feminism is openly socialistic, the Daily Chronicle shuddered in 1908, and went on to dismiss out of hand suffragists, suffragettes, and all the other phases in the crescendo of feminism. In those years, some writers used an alternative term, womanism, with the same hostility. One long-forgotten writer was roused to angry sneers in his memoirs when he recalled meeting an intellectual woman living in Paris. She comes across, despite his prejudices, as lively and interesting, whose writings reflected the strong-minded womanism of the 19th century. Curiously, one of the sharpest attacks on the word feminism came from Virginia Woolf, whose A Room of One's Own is such an effective and engaging plea for women. In 3 Guineas, written in 1938 in the shadow of fascism and of approaching war, and probably nervous about anyism, she rejects the word out of hand. No one word can capture the force which in the 19th century opposed itself to the force of the fathers, she insists, continuing, "Those 19th century women were in fact the advance guard of your own movement. They were fighting the tyranny of the patriarchal state as you were fighting the tyranny of the fascist state." They were called, to their resentment, feminists, she claims. She is historically inaccurate, the word was unknown in the previous century, and she goes on to insist that we must destroy an old word, a vicious and corrupt word that has done much harm in its day. The word feminist is the word indicated. That word, according to the dictionary, means one who champions the rights of women. Since the only right, the right to earn a living, has been won, the word no longer has a meaning, and a word without a meaning is a dead word, a corrupt word. But though Virginia Woolf's right to earn a living was and remains central to feminism, getting on for a century after she wrote it is clear that its attainment by no means solved all women's problems. Women's work, despite the much publicized earnings of some high flyers in the business world, remains lower paid, or, in the case of housework, not paid at all. When Woolf was writing in the 1920s, feminists had hardly begun to articulate, let alone address, women's special problems, issues to do with childbirth and child-rearing, or the strain on women who had to combine housework and/or childcare with work outside the home. Over the centuries and in many different countries, women have spoken out for their sex and articulated in different ways their complaints, their needs, and their hopes. As this is a very short introduction, I have concentrated on feminism in one country, England, and have tried to explore its development through time. While women in other countries have had different experiences and definitions, in England, right up until the 1960s at least, the word feminist was usually pejorative. Very few women, however deeply engaged in fighting for women's rights, would have described themselves as feminists. When women began to organize again in the 1960s and 1970s, the movement called itself women's liberation, borrowing the term from Black, Third World, and student movements. This was often shortened, sometimes affectionately, sometimes in a derogatory way, to women's lib. But those years also saw the word feminism being brought back into general use, and its meaning was extended. Though there was still a justified concern that civil and legal equality had not been fully achieved, all kinds of intellectual activity, she was scathing about the actual behavior of many of her contemporaries. Told from their infancy and taught by the examples of their mothers that they must find a man to support them, they learn to exploit their charms and looks until they find a man willing to support them. They rarely think and have few genuine feelings. But Wollstonecraft also accepted that, though better education for women is all important, it cannot change everything. Men and women must be educated in a great degree by the opinions and manners of the society they live in. And without a radical change in society, there can be no real revolution in female manners. In this present state of things, she finds it hardly surprising that so many women are ignorant, lazy, and irresponsible. It is interesting and rather sad that other women, even some highly literate ones, were among Wollstonecraft's sharpest critics. Hannah More, for example, refused even to read Wollstonecraft's book because its very title was absurd, while Hannah Cowley protested coyly that politics are unfeminine. Wollstonecraft's vindication may seem at first glance dated, but she is an effective writer. Her prose is down-to-earth, lively, and often tart. The book is still highly readable, and it remains one of the foundation stones of contemporary feminism. Her argument is circular, and because it is exploratory, often breaking new ground, can seem at times confused. She was sharply, sometimes bitterly, aware of the personal difficulties that women experienced in her society. She argued, for example, that an understanding of childhood is central to any self-knowledge. The ability to recognize one's own childishness is crucial to maturity. Till I can form some idea of the whole of my existence, I must be content to weep and dance like a child, long for a toy, and be tired of it as soon as I get it. A few months later, she wrote sadly to the philosopher and novelist William Godwin that my imagination is forever betraying me into fresh misery, and I perceive that I shall be a child to the end of the chapter. As we have seen, Wollstonecraft's story, Mary, a fiction, based in part on her own childhood and her difficult relationship with her parents, is an intriguing attempt to explore the way women grow up. It is also an occasionally heavy-handed celebration of her heroine's sensibility, that capacity for true feeling that sets her apart from other people. The book draws on Wollstonecraft's painful recognition of the way unresolved feelings from childhood so often dominate and even pervert adult relationships. How, throughout our lives, we may be unknowingly reenacting dramas rooted in the past. Women, she argued in The Vindication, are given little encouragement to become truly adult. They are made women of when they are mere children, and brought back to childhood when they ought to leave the go-kart forever. But any girl whose spirits have not been damped by inactivity or innocence by false shame will always be a romp, and the doll will never excite attention unless confinement allows her no alternative. In Thoughts on Education, she had insisted that marriage should be based on friendship and respect rather than love. In The Vindication, she claimed dismissively that most women remain obsessed by love, dreaming of happiness with some ideal and truly loving man simply because their lives are so empty. But it is in part Wollstonecraft's inconsistencies, her implicit recognition that there are no easy solutions to the problems she explores, that make her such an enduringly interesting writer. She sadly acknowledges that even the most sensible people are likely to fall prey to violent and constant passion, as she found to her cost when, on a visit to Paris in 1793, she met and fell in love with the American adventurer Gilbert Imlay. Her letters, after a happy beginning, become increasingly desperate as she complains about his blatant indifference. Pregnant by Imlay and thoroughly miserable, she still managed to work hard on her historical view of the origin and progress of the French Revolution. Her attitude to women revolutionaries was ambiguous, to say the least, and affected perhaps by her anxiety, given her personal situation, to assert her own respectability. When, in October 1789, Paris market women marched to Versailles and invaded the palace to put their complaints to the king, Wollstonecraft had no sympathy at all. She remarked, shuddering, that they were the lowest refuse of the streets, women who had thrown off the virtues of one sex without having the power to assume more than the vices of the other. After her baby Fanny was born, she undertook a trip to Sweden, taking along the baby and a nurse on business for Imlay. Her letters from the trip, published in 1796, are, unlike her letters from Paris, both perceptive and engaging. Be called upon to fight for his country, and that gives him a claim of some sort to have a voice in the conduct of its affairs. The debate offers some odd and revealing glimpses into attitudes towards women. Thus, in 1871, the political philosopher Thomas Carlyle remarked that the true destiny of a woman is to wed a man she can love and esteem, and to lead noiselessly under his protection, with all the wisdom, grace, and heroism that is in her, the life presented in consequence. And a great many women, as well, accepted the notion that by nature and God's decree, women were different to men. God meant them to be wives and mothers. If they deserted their proper sphere, it would lead to a puny, enfeebled, and sickly race. Progress, perhaps inevitably, proved very slow. Indeed, very many prominent women dismissed the vote as relatively unimportant, insisting, sometimes a shade disingenuously, that they personally had never suffered any disabilities from its lack. Florence Nightingale announced in 1867 that, "In the years that I have passed in government offices, I have never felt the want of a vote," and though she later conceded its importance, she always felt there were other more urgent problems facing women. The successful writer and journalist Harriet Martineau insisted that the best friends of the cause are the happy wives and the busy, cheerful, satisfied single women. Whatever a woman proves herself able to do, society will be thankful to see her do. Beatrix Potter attributed her own anti-feminism to the fact that I had never myself suffered the disabilities assumed to arise from my sex. The liberal Violet Markham came up with an evasive paradox. Many women are clearly superior to men, and therefore I don't like to see them trying to become man's equals. By 1889, the popular novelist and journalist Mrs. Humphrey Ward was claiming that the emancipating process has now reached the limits fixed by the physical constitution of women. Queen Victoria was sometimes hailed by suffragists as an example of what a woman was capable of. Barbara Lee Smith, for example, pointed out that our gracious queen fulfills the very arduous duties of her calling and manages also to be the mother of many children. But Victoria notoriously exclaimed in horror against the mad, wicked folly of women's rights. The Langham Place circle around Barbara Lee Smith played an important part in the long struggle for the vote, as in so many other campaigns. Early in 1866, they organized a suffrage petition with 1,499 signatures, which argued that person should be substituted for man, and that all householders, without distinction of sex, should be enfranchised. Emily Davies, who had worked so effectively for women's education, formally handed the petition to John Stuart Mill, whose book The Subjection of Women had just been published, and he presented it to Parliament in June 1866. It was, as they had expected, defeated by 194 votes to 73. But even this was welcomed as an encouraging start. Its effectiveness was perhaps confirmed by the number of hostile responses it attracted. The Spectator, for example, sneered that no more than 20 women in the country were politically capable. Women in general made political discussion unreal, tawdry, dressy. In October 1866, Lee Smith and a group of friends met at Elizabeth Garrett's home in London to form a suffrage committee, which the following year became the London Society for Women's Suffrage. They organized petitions which brought together more than 3,000 signatures. Lee Smith also produced a pamphlet on reasons for the enfranchisement of women. Several establishment papers, including the Cornhill and the Fortnightly Review, refused to print the argument for women's votes. Around the same time, a woman called Lydia Becker formed a similar society in Manchester. She had been drawn to the cause after hearing a paper given by Lee Smith. She formed a local women's suffrage committee and in 1870 founded the Women's Suffrage Journal. Pro-suffrage groups soon followed in Edinburgh, Bristol, and Birmingham. They proved important in keeping the issue alive through the decades ahead and keeping up pressure on Parliament. Public meetings were arranged, particularly in London and Manchester. Richard Pankhurst, who was involved in the Manchester group, had founded the English Woman's Review in 1866, and this helped publicize the suffragists' cause. It was perhaps inevitable that the suffragists were at times plagued by disagreements, particularly about tactics. Barbara Lee Smith soon withdrew from any formal participation in the London Committee. She disagreed with John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor, who insisted that it was useful to have men on the committee, though she later served as its nominal secretary. For all his early support, Mill shrank back nervously from later developments and more aggressive tactics. He disapproved particularly of the common vulgar motives and tactics of some women in Manchester. And the campaign to win the vote was to prove more difficult and much longer drawn out than its early supporters could have predicted. The issue was debated in Parliament and defeated year after year all through the 1870s. One Tory remarked in 1871 that women, who were sensitive and emotional by nature, should be protected from being forced into the hurly-burly of party politics. Woman's proper sphere was the home, her duty and her deepest pleasure to be a good wife or sister or daughter. Moreover, if women had much influence in Parliament, it would lead to hasty alliances with scheming neighbors, more class cries, permissive legislation, domestic perplexities, and sentimental grievances. The largest vote in favor of women's enfranchisement came in 1873, with 157 men in agreement. Suffrage abroad. At the same time, British suffragists and their opponents watched developments abroad with interest. One woman remarked that scarcely anything does more good to women's suffrage in England than seeing those who speak from personal experience. In fact, Antipodean examples seemed particularly encouraging. In New Zealand, women could vote from 1893. In Australia, state after state granted women the vote during the 1890s until in 1902, women could finally vote in federal elections. A conservative male professor remarked darkly in 1904 that, "I think Australia is doomed." On the other hand, Australian Aboriginals, male or female, could not vote until the late 1960s. In America, the states one by one enfranchised white women. By 1914, women could vote in 11 states, though they had to wait until 1919 for the national vote. Denmark enfranchised women in 1915 and the Netherlands in 1919. It is hardly surprising, given contemporary beliefs about a woman's role, that for decades suffragists achieved only small and undramatic victories, though in the long run these would prove very important in winning over public opinion. But claimed, pornography expresses fear of bodily knowledge and a desire to silence eros. Brown-Miller went on to argue that rape is nothing more or less than a conscious process of intimidation used against all women by all men. She is not sentimental about women. Her later book, Femininity, deconstructs disconcertingly and wittily the games girls learn almost from the cradle, the tricks and techniques for charming men and competing with other women. Femininity as we know it is romantic nonsense, something that has to be carefully contrived and preserved. It is the product of a nostalgic tradition of imposed limitation. But Against Our Will mocks bitterly and effectively the way crimes of violence against women are so often dismissed with crude commonplaces. No woman can be raped against her will. She was asking for it. If you're going to be raped, you might as well relax and enjoy it. She quotes, to telling effect, a female character in Rabbit Redux, a novel by the highly respected John Updike, who remarks dismissively, "You know what a rape usually is? It's a woman who changed her mind afterward." Unfortunately, this legitimate, urgently necessary insistence that rape is indeed a serious and violent crime was distorted by some later feminists. For another American, Catherine McKinnon, woman is always, indeed almost by definition, a victim. To be about to be raped is to be gender female in the process of going about life as usual, she insists. You grow up with your father holding you down and covering your mouth so another man can make a horrible, searing pain between your legs. When you are older, your husband ties you to a bed and drips hot wax on your nipples and brings in other men to watch and makes you suck his penis. In this 1,000 years of silence, the camera is invented and pictures are made of you while these things are being done. Her friend Andrea Dworkin argued that pornography is the law for women, and flatly, without any qualification, equated rape and sexual intercourse. As indeed did McKinnon, who from the opening paragraph of Only Words, 1995, offers a terrible paradigm of what she sees as female experience. A primal paternal rape that freezes us in a state of permanent terror. She constantly evokes the image of a once violated child who can never grow up, who she insists lives on in most women, even those who claim to enjoy consensual sex. The aggressor gets an erection, the victim screams and struggles and bleeds and blisters and becomes 5 years old. This is melodrama masquerading as feminism. Chapter 10. Feminists Across the World. Sisterhood is powerful was one of the most popular feminist slogans in the 1960s and 1970s. But the phrase has been questioned and sometimes contested both at the time and ever since. As the Black American poet Audre Lorde argued in 1983, it glosses over difference of race, sexuality, class, and age, advocating the mere tolerance of difference between women is the grossest reformism. It is a total denial of the creative function of difference in our lives. Her concerns were echoed in 1995 by Ian Ong, an Australian of Chinese descent, who suggested that the inevitable moments of failure of communication between feminists should be accepted as the starting point for a more modest feminism, one which is predicated on the fundamental limits to the very idea of sisterhood. We would gain more from acknowledging and confronting the stubborn solidity of communication barriers than from rushing to break them down in the name of an idealized unity. Both writers believe that white middle-class women often seem to be dictating a feminism that concentrates on gender discrimination, while tending to overlook, for example, the class differences and racial discrimination that complicate ideas about gender. Brazilian women have argued that feminism is Eurocentric, that it has nothing to say to them about urgent local problems, racial violence and health issues, as well as the difficulties Black women may encounter when looking for work. Indeed, some Latin American women actually reject the word feminism. There is also an increasing recognition that whereas Western feminists have struggled against sexism and against social and political inequalities, women in the Third World have had to confront additional and even more intractable problems. They often have to combat sexism in the form of deep-rooted local beliefs and practices to do with class, caste, religion, and ethnic biases. In some countries, their battle with these issues has been combined with and sometimes complicated by a struggle for the establishment of democratic government and for the most basic freedoms. But the lives of women in Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia and the Middle East have also been profoundly affected by colonialism and neocolonialism. First world countries, beginning with Britain and the rest of Europe in the 17th century, followed by the United States from the 19th century onwards, brought vast swaths of the world under their direct control, subjugating local peoples politically and economically. And at the beginning of the 21st century, the United States, by reason of its military, economic, and cultural power, practices a discursive colonization of much of the world. The term Third World is widely used in contemporary feminist and post-colonial studies, but it is fraught with difficulties. Chandra Talpade-Mahanti, for instance, defines it geographically. The nation-states of Latin America, the Caribbean, Sub-Saharan Africa, South and Southeast Asia, China, South Africa, and Oceania. She also includes Black, Asian, Latino, and indigenous peoples living in the West. But the phrase is sometimes seen as a pejorative label, implying underdeveloped or undemocratic when used by Westerners. Some references to Third World women are indeed a polite way of saying women of color, implying a native other in contrast to the norm of Western feminism. And it is sometimes considered more correct these days to talk of post-colonial feminism. But either term may serve as a useful reminder to Westerners of how little we know about the reality of these women's lives and the way they may be complicated by deep-rooted local beliefs, by practices arising out of class differency that we may have developed. That wider awareness is due to a number of factors. Technical advances are certainly important. The fact, for example, that feminists in different countries can now communicate quickly and effectively, share experiences and information with large numbers of people through the Internet. Academic feminism has played an important role in this. A great many universities, certainly in most Western countries, now run courses on women's studies, and specifically on feminism. Academic research has given us extremely valuable insights into women's lives at other times and in other cultures, inviting us to think about differences as well as about common causes. Academic theses, scholarly articles and texts, as well as conferences, have all helped disseminate important information about feminism across the world. But there is perhaps a loss involved, which is not often addressed or even acknowledged. I often recall, affectionately, the remark by Rebecca West that I quoted at the opening of this book. I myself have never been able to find out precisely what feminism is. I only know that people call me a feminist whenever I express sentiments that differentiate me from a doormat or a prostitute. All previous feminisms have had an air of excitement, of transgression, or of risk about them. Sometimes the excitement of the pioneer, sometimes of the outsider challenging convention. More recently, perhaps, there has been, in addition, the excitement of rediscovering our past, but also, and therefore, of reinventing something. In the late 1960s and the 1970s, women's liberation was exciting. We felt that we were making it new, that we were exploring both past and present, committing ourselves to something that was new and radical and adventurous. But the girls I talked to recently have never had any comparable experience. They seem uninterested in feminism, partly because they see it simply as an academic subject, something fed to them which they need not discover for themselves, and it is therefore respectably dull. Except, of course, for the high flyers who themselves aspire to academic jobs. Feminism has, as it were, been spoon-fed to this younger generation of women. So perhaps naturally and even healthily, they have a sneaking yearning to be politically incorrect. Rejecting academic feminism, at least, seems one way of moving forward. Reinventing feminism in terms of their own experience may, in the long run, prove another. But the other difficulty, and it seems to me a crucial one, is that academic feminism has developed a language that makes sense only to a closed circle of initiates. Too many women feel shut out, alienated. This is not only true of feminism, of course. This morning, as I was writing this, I opened the newspaper to find an exhilarating attack by the journalist Robert Fisk on what he calls the preposterous, even poisonous language so often used by academics in general. Used even, perhaps especially, by those who address urgently important political issues. University teachers are great at networking each other, but hopeless at communicating with most of the rest of the world, including those who collect their rubbish, deliver their laundry, and serve up their hash browns. He ends by jokingly quoting a famous remark by Winston Churchill. "This is English up with which I will not put." It would be all too easy to make the same case specifically against academic feminism. Fisk's point is one that we ignore at our peril. If feminism is to be something living and evolving, it will have to begin by reinventing the wheel, which in this case means finding not just new issues, but a new language. In spite of everything, I still have faith that feminism will take us by surprise again, that it will reinvent itself, perhaps in unforeseen ways, and in areas we have thought little about. It will almost certainly come from outside the academy and will probably, hopefully, challenge us in ways that, as yet, we cannot even glimpse.
This has been an Audible Inc. production of Feminism, A Very Short Introduction, by Margaret Walters, read by Allison Johnson. Executive producer, Maria Olson. Producer, Mike Charzik. Production coordinator, Kat Lambrix. Engineer-director, Cliff Charles. Editor, Charles Clerk. Music composed by Michael Whalen. Copyright 2005 by Margaret Cook. Production copyright 2009 by Audible Inc.